Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. This is my first review of 2025, and my New Year resolution was to review the new MSI Claw, so that's what we're going to do here today. Now, it's been less than a year since the last MSI Claw released, and I wasn't a huge fan of that one, and this one kind of feels like a do-over. As I'll demonstrate throughout this video, it looks like they've improved almost every little thing about this handheld, to the point where it feels like a second-generation device. And the biggest improvement has to do with this new Intel Lunar Lake CPU. Throughout my week of testing with this device, I was constantly impressed by how many games ran at really low wattages, and because we have an 80 watt-hour battery in this new Claw, that means that we can get hours and hours of gameplay on it. But just because the MSI Claw has been improved doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually a good handheld or something that I can recommend. The bottom line is that the new MSI Claw costs $900 retail, and I don't see it being hundreds of dollars better than the competition. And so yes, this will be a bit of a conflicted review, because I think the MSI Claw is an excellent handheld, but I don't see it being worth $900 retail. Anyway, we got a lot of ground to cover here, so grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started with the unboxing and taking a look at the handheld, let's go over a couple disclaimers first. Number one, this is a review unit sent over and it's a loaner, which means that I'm going to send it back just as soon as I'm done making this video. Now, in addition to the loaner unit they sent over for review, they also sent me out to an MSI event last month. And during that event, I had the opportunity to have an early access look at the MSI Claw, kind of poke and prod it, but then also talk to the MSI Claw team and kind of get an idea of the background and what they changed and why they did it. Now, in full disclosure, MSI paid for my flight over there as well as the hotel while I was there, and then I just flew back home afterwards. And I've done a couple of these events before, both when I was a cookbook author, but then also most recently with the ROG Ally X last summer. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that I'm really sensitive about this stuff. I don't like using any sort of ads. I don't have any sponsorship deals within any of my videos. But when it comes to trips like this is something that I often will agree to, and that's because it gives me an early access to the device so that I can review it better when I actually make my video. And so one of my rules about this is that if I get a chance to look at the device right then and there, I'm not going to make a video about that preview right there in the event. Instead, I'm going to wait till I get home and maybe test the device first, and then finally make a review video like this one. And so that's why you didn't see a preview video about this device. Instead, I'm just kind of lumping this all together, because even though it was great to get a feel for the device, I wasn't ready to make a whole video about it yet. I needed more time to test it, and so that's what I've done for this video. Either way, all of my typical review stuff still applies, so I wasn't paid or sponsored to make this video in any way. All opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this video ahead of time. They did not dictate what I can and cannot say about this review. The only thing they gave me in terms of embargo was just the date, and that was the 26th of December. But to be honest, that was like a week ago, and I was spending Christmas with my family, and so that's why I didn't make this video earlier. But the nice thing about taking my sweet time in making this video is that I spent a lot of time during this Christmas vacation playing with it, and so I have a pretty mature understanding of what this device is and what it could potentially be. So let's start with the specs, and I think the CPU is really the star of the show with the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus. It's running the Intel Core Ultra 7 258V, which is known as a Lunar Lake processor. And this processor in particular is really geared towards being efficient and working well with handhelds, and I think that's really evident here with this device. We've also got 32 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM running at 8500 megatransfers per second. And it also has 1 terabyte of storage with an M.2 2230 drive. Now, one of the big bumps here is the display. Not only is it 1 inch larger, it's now 8 inches, but it also has a 16:10 aspect ratio, making it taller. This gives us a resolution of 1920 by 1200. So essentially it is a 1080p screen, but a little bit taller because of that aspect ratio. It's also running at 120 Hz, and it is a variable refresh rate display. Basically everything from 48 Hz up to 120 will work with variable refresh. The battery has also been greatly improved. It is now 80 watt hours like the ROG Ally X, and it also supports up to a 65 watt fast charge. But that battery does come at a cost, and that's going to be weight. So it's 795 grams, which is pretty heavy. It's about 1.75 pounds. In terms of connectivity, we're looking at Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, and it also has 2 Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports. And they've also upgraded the analog sticks and triggers. They now have magnetic Hall effect sensors. Okay, so here's a look at the device itself, and first thing you may notice is this new color. They're calling it sandstone. And And to be honest, when I first saw it, I wasn't a huge fan of it, but actually getting it in hand, I actually like it a lot. It definitely looks different than the typical black handhelds that you see, the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally, the Lenovo Legion Go, even the old MSI Claw. I think this one has just a little bit more personality. In fact, it kind of gives me a bit of a retro vibe, like it feels like a Microsoft Zune. Now, my second impression of the handheld itself is that it is rather big. In fact, because we have this taller screen, it feels like it's made for larger hands. The way I typically hold this device is that I palm it underneath like this, which means that I can just barely reach all of the controls with my medium-sized hands. So if you have smaller hands, this might be a little bit too big. But the nice trade-off is that if you have large hands, then this might be perfectly suited for you. But also because we have a larger device with a bigger screen, it is a bit heavier, especially with that 80 watt-hour battery, and so it is quite a bit heavier than the original model. In fact, before we go any further, let's do a couple size and weight comparisons. My MSI Claw here is 790 grams, which makes it about 130 grams more than the Steam Deck OLED. The original MSI Claw was about the same weight as the original Steam Deck, maybe a little bit more, but still within spitting distance. And same thing with the ROG Ally X. Despite having an 80 watt-hour battery, it's still about 110 grams lighter than the MSI Claw 8. And I can definitely feel that 110 gram difference from the ROG Ally X to the MSI Claw. At this point, the only mainstream handheld that is heavier than the MSI Claw is now the Lenovo Legion Go. So the new Claw kind of splits the difference between a Steam Deck and a Legion Go. It's about halfway between those. It's also quite a large handheld. A lot of that has to do with that 16:10 display. Here's the ROG Ally X, which has a 7-inch display and it's also 16:9, so it is smaller. And the original MSI Claw also had a similar display to the ROG Ally and Ally X. And even though the MSI Claw was definitely a pretty large handheld, you can see that the new one is a lot bigger. It's about the same size as the Steam Deck, but it feels larger, and I think that's because it flares out at the bottom as opposed to flaring in like the Steam Deck. And at this point, this makes the new MSI Claw the second largest mainstream handheld behind the Lenovo Legion Go, which has an 8.8-inch screen. So long story short, yes, this is a big handheld, and it's definitely something that's made for larger hands. Now, in addition to changing out the screen and the overall size of the handheld, they also made additional changes to the components. Let's start with these analog sticks. So these are now a little bit larger and also have a much grippier base to them. Not only that, the grippy part of the stick is a lot harder of a plastic material. It almost feels 3D printed, and I kind of like that. It's very, very grippy. Now, the original MSI Claw also had a very similar grippy part to it, but it was only in the very edge of it, and so it wasn't a very grippy joystick altogether. So I do appreciate this new design. It reminds me a lot of an Xbox Series controller, but actually a little bit grippier. In addition, these are Hall sensor sticks, and one other thing worth noting is that the tension on this is still very light. I know a lot of people like to have more tension in their sticks, and this feels a lot like the original Claw or the original ROG Ally, and so if you want something light feeling, yes, this works well, but if you want more tension, this is not going to be it. Now, personally, I prefer lighter tensions, so I actually find it to be a bonus, but it's really going to come down to you. Another adjustment is the D-pad. This now has more prominent bumps in the cardinal directions. It also feels a little bit more responsive with a better pivot. It is a rubber membrane D-pad, but it does feel nice and tactile. And largely it is very similar in design to the original one, but having these more prominent ends does make it very easy to press the directions when you want to. In terms of real-world testing, it reminds me of an old-school D-pad because it is a hard plastic. The pivot in it does work well, and so playing a game like Contra, it actually does pass this test. I'm able to press down the D-pad and then rock it left and right and keep my character stationary when I want to. What this means is that I can press those cardinal directions without getting an accidental diagonal, and so this is a good thing, especially when it comes to retro gaming. It also passes the Street Fighter test. When I want to press a diagonal, I can do it pretty easily. It did take me a couple days to get used to the rolling pattern so that I could use games like this a little bit better, but I think from a functional standpoint, yes, it's hitting all the points that I want to. My only main concern about this D-pad is that because this plastic is so slick and grippy, and because we have these really prominent edges and a harder plastic, it does make it a little bit painful to roll over time. It reminds me of the old days when I used to play my NES controller until my thumb started to hurt, and so I've had some of those moments here with this D-pad as well. And again, it really just comes down to these prominent ends and the harder plastic. For most modern games, it won't be an issue at all, because you're mostly going to be using it for things like changing out weapons. But when it comes to playing Street Fighter, it is functionally a good D-pad, but not something I would actually look forward to using. Also on the left side, we've got our select button as well as our MSI Center M button. This will bring up their own little software. We'll go over this in detail later in the video. Now let's look at the right side. So the analog stick is going to be similar to the one on the left, but then also we have these face buttons. And these are also glossy buttons, but they are nice and rounded and have a nice rubber membrane feel to them. They remind me a lot of an Xbox controller. And they're very similar to the original ones. I'm not sure if there's anything actually changed between them, and I actually liked them on the original MSI Claw, so no complaints here between the two. Also on the right side, we've got our start button and then our quick settings menu. This will actually pop up on the left side, which is a little bit disorienting, but this is how you would bring it up. Other than that, on the front, we've got our 2 stereo speakers, and the audio quality on the MSI Claw has always been one of its high points. Now for me, when it comes to audio with a handheld, I kind of have 3 different categories. The first is if it's so bad that it actually takes away from the gaming experience. The middle one is whether or not, you even notice it at all. And then the third one is whether or not the audio is so good that you actually notice it, but in a good way. And I would say that the original MSI Claw, as well as this one, are in that third category, where the audio is really good. In fact, it goes toe-to-toe with the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally, which I've always felt have some of the best audio when it comes to a handheld PC. In fact, let's do a quick audio test so you can hear what it sounds like. And so yes, I think the new MSI Claw falls into that third category where it enhances your overall gaming experience. Okay, now let's take a look at these shoulder and trigger buttons, and these also have a very Xbox style to them, and they have been completely revamped from the original. The original one had similar bumpers, but a totally different trigger. You can see this one is more like a paddle, whereas this one is, again, a lot like an Xbox Series controller. I also like that they have a nice texture on the new ones as well. Now, one of my big sticking points of the original was that the bumpers were really mushy. It has a hinge right here in the center, which means that just pushing it down right here is really unsatisfying. In addition, because the hinge is up here, it's almost impossible to press down the bumper from here. Now the hinge on this feels a little bit different because at least I can press it from every angle except for right here at the very edge. And it has a more tactile feel to it altogether. It's a little bit louder, but I like the fact that it's more responsive. And like I mentioned, the triggers have been completely redesigned, and I like the new one a lot better. And this button is a little bit more narrow, but the way that I hold my hand like this, I can just kind of reach over and then press this really lightly with the tip of my finger. And so pressing on this trigger is really satisfying, and the travel on it is not super deep either, which means that I can just kind of press it to the side, and it feels really responsive. Let's take a look at the I/O. So we have our power button, which is a fingerprint sensor, then also an LED light, and then our micro SD card slot, and then 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. And these can be used for charging as well as accessories and video out. On the right side, we've got our headphone jack as well as our volume up and down, and that's about it, other than the cooling you can see up here on the top. And in terms of cooling, this is a dual fan design. You can see them both right here. So the air will go inside like this and then push out the top. And I will say that in terms of cooling, it does a really good job. Not only is it really quiet, but it also does not heat up the device much at all. In fact, throughout my week of testing, there was not a single moment where I ever felt this device getting warm or being loud. In fact, it's almost impossible to hear the fan while you're playing. Also on the back, we've got 2 paddles that can be programmed, and to be honest, I just really didn't use these much at all. And to be honest, given this design here on the back and the fact that they are relatively flush, I honestly just forgot these buttons were here in the back. I just kind of hold the device like this, and so I never really feel these buttons either. And for me, this is great because I typically will not use these buttons, so it's great that I'm not distracted by them, but they're also easy to press down on when you want to, and so this will be good if you want to use them as well. Other than that, that's about it. There's nothing on the bottom or the sides in terms of I/O. So let's talk about the ergonomics and overall feel of this handheld. And there have been a lot of changes to the back of this handheld in particular. I wasn't a fan of these original grips because they just went straight down in a line, and especially around here, it didn't feel very comfortable to hold. But with the new MSI Claw, it feels like they went a different route. Not only do they have this kind of rib texture to it, but it's also a lot shallower than the original one in terms of grips. Because we no longer have like a prominent edge to it, it doesn't feel like you're supposed to grab on it at all. Instead, you just kind of roll your hands across the back. And given the weight of this device, I think it actually works out pretty well. So what I do is I palm it right here in the bottom of my palm, and then I just kind of splay my hands across the back like this. And so generally when I'm holding this, I'm anchoring it right here in the center of the palm, so that's where all the weight is actually resting. And this does work out pretty well because this is pretty rounded right here on the side, so I haven't felt any sort of fatiguing by holding it right here. And this gives me the space to kind of pull my fingers all the way through, and then also I can reach up to the shoulders and triggers when I need to right here on the side. And like I mentioned, I have medium-sized hands, and this has been a good fit for me. I can reach all the buttons no problem. It's a bit of a stretch to get to the start button. I have to actually pivot a little bit, but other than that, there's really no issue. And so in terms of ergonomics, I think this is better than the original MSI Claw because it doesn't have as much of a prominent grip to it, but it's still really comfortable. The biggest detractor for me is the weight. At almost 800 grams, it does get a little bit heavy. And so often what I will do is I'll hold it like this, and then I will rest it in my lap. And because we have a larger 8-inch screen, I can kind of comfortably see it from my lap to the screen itself. But then also if I want a closer look, I can always bring it up like this and then hold it while I'm playing as well. But given that it's so heavy, I kind of alternate between the two. And so I'll hold it like this if I really need to read something, but most of the time I just kind of rest it on my lap. So long story short, if you have medium to large sized hands, I think this will be a really excellent fit. And then also if you feel like the Steam Deck was a little bit too heavy, this is going to be even heavier, so it might not be as comfortable. Okay, now let's talk about the screen. This is 8 inches, 1920 by 1200, 16 by 10 aspect ratio. In terms of brightness, we've got a pretty good range. So this is the brightest setting here, and then this is the very lowest right here. And this does get dim enough to be able to use comfortably in the dark like this. But I will note that this screen could be a little bit brighter, especially if you're going to be playing somewhere bright like outdoors. Here's what it looks like at max brightness in late afternoon under direct sunlight. It is definitely something that you could probably manage, but I don't find this to be very enjoyable. And so I think this is a handheld that I would much rather play indoors than out. Now when it comes to richness and vibrancy, I do think that the colors are a little bit more saturated than they were on the original MSI Claw. You can see that the red in the car here is just a little bit more prominent. I think it looks really good. It's a similar story with the original ROG Ally and Ally X, which had the same screen. You can see here that they also are less saturated than the MSI Claw. So I think that overall this is actually a pretty nice looking LCD panel. It doesn't quite compare to a Steam Deck OLED, which has, a lot darker blacks and also more vibrant and rich colors. But for an LCD panel, I think it does hold its own. The only panel with an LCD that I think looks better than this one is going to be the Lenovo Legion Go. I've always liked the rich saturation of the Legion Go, and so the MSI Claw would be in second place between the two. So long story short, I think the colors and saturation are good on this panel. It just doesn't get quite as bright as I would like. Okay, now let's talk about software, and obviously this is running Windows 11. If we press this button, it'll bring up the MSI Center M. This is essentially going to put together all of your games into one package. And you can use a variety of different gaming platforms. I just have my Steam library here, but this is where you could choose some of the other ones. You've got a couple options. You can just scroll left and right and choose your games from here, or you can also go into what they call the game library. This will show all of them at once. But to be honest, I haven't really used this to launch my games just because the layout is a little bit unintuitive, so I just use Steam Big Picture mode. Another third-party option you could use if you have multiple different libraries is Play Night. So this is just an app that you can install directly on your device, and it has a full screen mode, and it works pretty well. So this will be good if you specifically are using games from multiple different libraries, not just Steam, so you could use this instead. Either way, you've got quite a few options when it comes to navigating games, much like any other handheld PC. Now also in the MSI app, we've got a couple other options. In fact, this is the one that I use the most. They call it User Scenario, but this is where you can change your power profile. They've got this one called AI Engine, which is supposed to be like an auto TDP, where it finds exactly what you need and doesn't use any more than that. And so if you want a really simplified or Steam Deck style experience where you can just set it to AI Engine and then let that run from there, you can definitely do that. But I found that tweaking it within the other settings has been more beneficial. To start, they have one called Endurance, and this basically runs at around 13 watt TDP, so this is supposed to be your battery saving mode. When you're playing lightweight games, this does work out really well, but you also have manual options. You can go between 8, 17, and 30 watts. And I found in particular that the 8 and 17 watt options have just given me more consistent performance compared to Endurance as well as the AI Engine. So altogether, we're looking at multiple different options just within the MSI Claw app to change your power profiles. We've got 3 right here and then 2 others, so 5 altogether. But this is where things can get a little bit wonky because the MSI options are not the only thing that you have out of the box. If we go back to the regular Windows settings, we've got this little eye icon. If we go in here, it's the Intel graphics software. And within here, you can do things like update your drivers, but also within the graphics section, we've got this thing called Endurance Gaming. And here you can turn it on, and then you'll have multiple different options. You've got efficiency, balance, and performance. The efficiency one is going to try to run your game at 30 frames per second, balance is going to do 40, and then performance is going to go up to 60. And so this is kind of similar to the AI gaming option, other than you can change it to a specific frame rate as well. And I think it's a neat option, but it's also kind of weird that we have something very similar within the MSI options as well. It gets pretty confusing. It also doesn't help that this option is called endurance, much like the Intel one, even though they do completely different things. In addition, not every game is going to work with the endurance gaming mode within the Intel app as well. And so sometimes you can set this to efficiency, which is supposed to run at only 30 frames per second, but it'll still run at like 120 hertz. Also bear in mind that within the quick menu settings, we have the ability to change our resolution as well as our refresh rate. And so this may conflict with the software as well. So long story short, we've got a bunch of different options to change our power profiles. And this can get kind of frustrating because every single game needs a little bit of experimentation to find out which works the best for it. In a perfect world, the AI engine would make all the games run optimally, but I found that for games like Celeste, for example, using the AI engine will pull about 15 watts when it only needs about 3 or 4. Instead, I got to go into the manual section, then turn it to an 8 watt TDP, and then it'll drop down to about 4 watts from there. I could also do a similar thing with this one. I could set it to auto and then set it to the performance mode, which means it's going to run at 60 frames per second. And this also will draw down the TDP to about 4 watts in Celeste. So there are multiple ways to adjust the power profile, and this is probably one of my bigger recommendations, is that they figure out a way that makes it more universal and easy to access with just the controller. Moving on, we've also got our control mode. So here we can change between gamepad and desktop mode, and essentially desktop mode just means that when you turn this on, you can use your left analog stick as a mouse cursor. Now the quick settings option has been revamped as well, so here we can change out our manual TDP modes. We can do that right here on the fly. In addition, we can change out a resolution as well as a refresh rate, but the interesting thing that now has been added to it is actual Xbox or Microsoft integration. So this is the first handheld that I've seen that actually has this stuff right here, where you can actually, sign into your Xbox profile, talk to your friends, things like that. So it's kind of like pressing the Xbox button on your controller to bring in the game bar and everything else within it. Altogether, when it comes to the software, I think it is functional, but it could be better, especially when it comes to these power profiles, because in addition to all this right here, we have all the other things that Intel provides as well. Okay, next I want to jump into performance, and there's a few things we want to do. First, they're going to be benchmarks, then we'll actually talk about playing games. And I did a series of benchmarks on 5 different handhelds and operating systems. And in terms of handhelds, you can see I used the Steam Deck OLED, the old MSI Claw, as well as ROG Ally X running both Bazzite and Windows, as well as the new MSI Claw that we're reviewing here today. Now, 3D Mark Time Spy doesn't officially work through SteamOS or Bazzite, and so those are going to be grayed out. We're just going to focus on Windows. And you can see here that for each benchmark, I also did it at 4 different power profiles. So the first one is going to be when the device is plugged in. Then the next one is going to be in turbo mode or 30 watts. Sometimes it's 25 depending on the device. Our next mode is going to be around 17 watts. And then finally we have our battery saver mode, which is somewhere between 11 and 12. And you can see here that each of the profiles, the ROG Ally X actually performed worse than the MSI Claw, both the old and the new. But me personally, I'm always skeptical of benchmarks like this because after all, they're just numbers and we're here to play games. Next, I did a bunch of in-game benchmarks and I focused on a few different options. And let's break down these numbers a little bit. We'll start with the Steam Deck OLED. So you can see here that I have it running at the 17 watt mode, but really it's around 15 watts on the Steam Deck. This one also doesn't have any sort of turbo mode when you plug it in, so the numbers are going to be the same between the two. For the rest of the scores, you can see that the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus actually does better than all the other devices. However, one thing to note, with the original MSI Claw 155H, this one does not do well when it comes to low power modes. The problem here is that it always pushes more power than you actually want it to. So even though it's saying it got 35 frames per second at 17 watts, it wasn't actually running at 17 watts. Instead, it was closer to 30. And so that's why the numbers are similar to when it's running at 30. Same thing with the 12 watt mode with the MSI Claw. That was running closer to 20 or 25. And so that's why those have an asterisk next to them, is because you can't really trust these numbers with the original MSI Claw. Regardless, you can see that from a numbers perspective, the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus gave me the best scores. However, again, I'm also skeptical of in-game benchmarks, so let's talk about in-game gameplay. So starting with the MSI Claw 8, like I mentioned, this one had the best scores, and it does run relatively smoothly. However, from a driver perspective, I found that something was off when trying to play this game with an Intel chip. In particular, I found that the fog was oversaturated, and it was really hard to see what was going on in the screen. Even when I was going into the non-foggy parts, all the details seemed to be lost because of the lighting. And this is just running at standard 800p and with low settings. Now playing the same game with the same settings on the ROG Ally X running with an AMD chip, this one is lit a lot better. And so to me, this looks like some sort of driver optimization thing where it's just not really working with Intel just yet, whereas the AMD one seems to be a little bit more optimized. And honestly, between the two, the frame rate was about the same, even if the benchmark was better with the MSI Claw. Both of these games running at similar settings give me about 35 to 40 frames per second, both very playable. But it just so happens that the MSI Claw looks a lot worse than on the ROG Ally, and that's probably because of drivers. Let's try another game that doesn't have these drivers issues. So let's talk about Cyberpunk 2077. And again, the original MSI Claw had the worst scores among them. This one also had the same power draw issues where even at a lower TDP, it was pulling more power than I wanted. And you can see here that in the higher wattages, both the ROG Ally X in Bazzite and in Windows do better than the MSI Claw 8. However, the interesting thing here is that at a lower power profile at 12 watts, the MSI Claw actually pulls quite a bit ahead. And that was one of the more surprising things for me when playing Cyberpunk 2077 is that I could set this to a 17 watt TDP and it would actually run really well. I got an average of about 40 frames per second, so not quite enough to be able to kick in the VRR, but still it's a really smooth experience. And altogether it's drawing about 25 watts from the battery, which is going to give me over 3 hours of battery life with these settings. So long story short, when it comes to Cyberpunk, yes, the benchmarks are in favor of the ROG Ally, but still, it's actually a really fun experience to play on the MSI Claw. I'm not really one to split hairs about whether or not something is going to get more frames per second than the other. For me, it's all about whether or not it's an enjoyable experience, and I found that Cyberpunk on this device is fun to play. And then finally for our last benchmark, this is going to be Horizon Zero Dawn. Again, same options here of 800 or 720p with low settings. And again here, the original MSI Claw really just can't keep up with the others. Not only is the performance about half as the others, it still has all those power draw issues at the lower TDPs. Now when it comes to benchmarks, the MSI Claw still does worse than the AMD platforms, even worse than the Steam Deck at 17 watts. And it is quite a stark difference between the two when it comes to benchmarks. Now when it comes to actually playing the game, it's still a very good experience. Again, I capped this at a 17 watt performance profile, but I'm getting an average about 45 frames per second. It feels really good. And again here, it's drawing about 25 watts total package power, which is going to be over 3 hours of gameplay. And so this is a pretty great experience all around. And so in a vacuum, I would say that yes, I wouldn't mind playing Horizon Zero Dawn on the new MSI Claw, especially compared to the old one. So now let's talk about actual performance testing and how I played each of these games. And I really found myself using just kind of 3 different methods. The first was just to set it to an 8 watt TDP and use that for all indie and lightweight games. So starting with Celeste here, I set it to an 8 watt TDP, but you can see that it draws down a bunch, around 3 to 4 watts instead. And that gives me a ton of battery life. We'll do some more in-depth battery life testing later in the video. But regardless, if you want to play a lightweight game, I found that basically all of them will run at an 8 watt TDP with absolutely no problem. It'll be up to you whether or not you want to change it up and use 120 frames per second or just 60, or if you want to use the full 1200p resolution or drop it down to 800. But the nice thing is that none of that stuff really matters, because as long as you set it to that 8 watt TDP, it will usually draw down the battery a bunch and give you some really efficient gaming. And this is a breath of fresh air compared to the original MSI Claw, because when you set this one to the battery saving mode, it would actually just pull a bunch more wattage than you wanted. And so not only did the original MSI Claw have a smaller battery, but it used to pull a bunch of the power as well, giving you terrible battery life. And this is the opposite problem, where I found myself getting somewhere between 6 and 12 hours of gameplay depending on the game that I was playing. And another thing that surprised me about the CPU was how many games I could play at that 8 watt TDP. I could actually push some pretty intensive games. Some games that really impressed me were some of the more advanced role-playing games like Octopath Traveler 2. I could set this to an 8 watt TDP and it would pull maybe a 12 to 13 watt total package power. And again, this is going to give you somewhere around 6 hours of battery life, which is pretty impressive. I also found the same thing with some more graphically intensive platforming games like Ori and the Blind Forest. But probably my biggest surprise was that I was able to play Hades at 800p and at 8 watts, and it would give me well over 60 frames per second. And so I was really surprised at how efficient this chipset was at those lower TDPs, that it would not pull a bunch of power, but still play some pretty intensive games. And so that's my recommendation when it comes to lightweight and indie games, is set it to an 8 watt TDP, and you might be surprised how many games actually play at that lower power profile. In a perfect world, we would just use the AI engine option, which would draw down the power as needed, but I found that this doesn't work as well as just setting it manually to 8 watts. Now for my next set of games, and those are going to be more AAA titles that I want to run at only around 40 frames per second, I found the easiest way to do that is to turn on endurance gaming within the Intel options and then set it to balanced. That's going to limit it to 40 frames per second, but then also draw down the power to meet it. And a good example here is going to be Crisis Core. This is a game where you cap it to 40 frames per second, but it doesn't need those full 17 watts, so it's going to draw down less than that. And so instead, the TDP is going to drop to around 14 watts, so it's going to save you a little bit of battery life while still giving you a nice smooth experience at 40 frames per second. And so in particular, I found this works out really well with Xbox 360 era games, where at 40 frames per second it still feels nice and smooth, but it'll save you a bit of battery life in the long run. And it is pretty impressive how many games will run at this 40 frames per second and not pull a lot of power. For example, here with Control, it averages somewhere between like 15 to 17 watts, and again, I think it looks pretty good. And same thing with Elden Ring, I can cap this at 40 frames per second, and the TDP will hover around 17 watts as well. Now for my third crop of games, I found that setting it to manual 17 watts will usually give me the best performance altogether and a nice balance between the battery life. And a 17 watt TDP means that it will generally pull about 25 watts of power from the battery, which means that you'll get over 3 hours of gameplay. And again, I found that using the AI engine would just make it draw more power than I wanted. And so setting it to 17 watts manually usually gave me better battery life. And this I found to be a great overall option when it comes to lightweight games like Stray, but even more intensive games like Doom Eternal. You can definitely pull more watts and get better frames per second with many of these games, but I found this to be a really nice balance mode altogether. Doom Eternal runs well over 60 frames per second, and something like Spider-Man also runs at around 40. With this same power profile, Ratchet & Clank gives me around 35 frames per second, which I find to be very playable. And also bear in mind that if the game supports Intel XeSS upscaling, I would recommend it. For example, here with Ratchet & Clank, I'm running it at 1200p, but with XeSS turned on, and I think it looks great. Now, as a last resort, you could also turn on the 30 watt power profile. That's going to draw as much power as possible from the device. But one thing to keep in mind is that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to pull a full 30 watts of power. It really depends on the game and how it works with the Intel drivers. For example, Final Fantasy XVI was not a great experience when playing on this device. This game would drop well below 30 frames per second even with 800p low settings turned on. But if you look at the top right, it isn't pulling a full 30 watt TDP. Instead, it's hovering around 25. And no matter what settings I tried to use, I couldn't ever get it to pull a full 30, which I think would probably give it a smoother gameplay experience. So there are going to be some games that don't work well with this device. It's really going to depend on the drivers and the game and everything else in terms of support. And so there will definitely be games, especially more modern games, that won't run really well on the new MSI Claw. And honestly, I'm not super surprised by this given the fact that this is a brand new device, brand new CPU, and the drivers are being constantly updated. Okay, let's switch gears and start talking about emulation performance, and we're going to go through the whole gamut here. And one of the more interesting things I want to stress about this device in particular is that it works really well when it comes to retro gaming. Number one, the display is 16:10, which means it's going to work really well with 4:3 content because it is a taller screen. That means you're going to have black bars on the left and right, but they're not quite as big as it would be on something like the ROG Ally. In addition, because we have a 120Hz screen, that means within RetroArch you can turn on black frame insertion. This means that for games that originally ran at 60 Hz, it's going to put a black frame between the two, and it's going to give you some really nice motion clarity. It is going to make the screen a little bit dimmer, so this is definitely not something you want to play outdoors, but it does make the games look really nice. And it's really hard to convey just how nice this looks in terms of motion clarity in a YouTube video, but suffice to say, it almost feels like playing on a CRT, and having that aspect ratio really helps as well. Another system that works really well with this device is Game Boy Advance because the original aspect ratio was very similar to 16:10. And so these games almost feel like they were meant to be played on the MSI Claw. And because this chip works so well at those efficient and lower TDPs, this actually does really well with heavy-duty shaders. So for example here, playing Super Nintendo games within RetroArch with BFI turned on and using the CRT Royale Bloom shader, it's still only pulling about a 5 watt TDP. This means that you should get somewhere around 10 hours of gameplay when playing Super Nintendo games like this. And so even though I don't think a lot of people are going to be spending $900 on a handheld in order to play retro games, it is nice to see that if you do want to play 4:3 content, it looks really good here within RetroArch with BFI turned on. And even playing something really intensive like Sega Saturn with the Beetle Core, it only takes about a 10 watt TDP, so you'll get lots of battery life as well. Okay, moving on, let's talk about some more intensive retro emulation. We'll start with GameCube. These games are going to run great at a 3x resolution. That's going to fill out the resolution of the display, and again, because most of these games were 4:3, they're going to look awesome. As you get into the more intensive games, it is going to draw more power, but still not a ton, around 14, maybe 15 watts. It'll be a similar story with PlayStation 2, again playing these games at a 3x resolution, and they're all going to run really smoothly. But it is going to draw more power, usually around 17 or 18 watts to play these at a 3x resolution. Either way, the games run great, and I didn't have any sort of compatibility issues when using the DirectX 11 backend. Moving on, I want to test out Wii U using the hardest game to run, which is this one right here. And I'm using a graphics pack to actually expand this to a full 1200p resolution, so it's filling up the whole screen. And you can see here that I'm getting an average about 45 to 50 frames per second, so still a really excellent gameplay experience. Now let's talk about a couple systems that don't work as well as I was hoping. We'll start with the original Xbox, and I found that just about every game I played, even at a native resolution, did not play at full speed. There's probably a couple factors at play. Number one is the CPU, and given the fact that it's brand new, the developers of this emulator probably haven't gotten their hands on it. And also the Xbox app is still a bit of a work in progress, so many of these games are really hard to run, and so I'm not surprised here that these games are not running at full speed. But long story short, I definitely would not recommend buying this device specifically to play Xbox games, because all the ones that I tried did not play at full speed. And it was the same issue when it came to Xbox 360, and again probably for the exact same reasons. Most of these games played at half speed, about 15 frames per second, which made them completely unplayable. So when it comes down to it, either Xbox or Xbox 360 just do not play well on this device as far as I can tell. However, one system that does emulate really well on the MSI Claw is going to be PlayStation 3. This development is quite a bit further ahead than those other two apps, and so I'm not super surprised that this runs so well. For many of the lighter weight games, you can just set it to a manual 17 watt TDP, and most of these will play at full speed. I got a couple drops and dips with Demon Souls, but still it stayed well above 50 frames per second, so totally playable. But for most of the more intensive games, I found that manually setting it to 30 watts gave me the best performance. For example, here with Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty, I actually set this to a 1.5x resolution upscale. This means the game is running at 1080p, and it looks beautiful on this display, and it's running at well over 50 frames per second. This is a game that as long as you're getting over 30 frames per second, it's going to feel smooth, so all of this is bonus. Same thing with Infamous, which is a harder to run game, and again, as long as it's running over 30 frames per second, it's going to be great. And the average here was about 40 to 45, so yes, a very good gameplay experience with this game. And it's the exact same experience with God of War 3. This one hovers well above 30 frames per second most of the time, unless it was compiling shaders at the same time. And so this is a game that I would consider to be playable as well, even if it is only at the native resolution. But bear in mind that because we're playing at a 30 watt TDP, it is going to draw quite a bit of power, over 40 watts. And with an 80 watt hour battery, that means you're going to get less than 2 hours of battery life. Speaking of which, that's a good segue into our next section, which is going to be talking about battery life on this device. I tested out 5 different games here, and we'll start with the right side and then work our way left into the worst case scenario. In our best case, it's going to be Celeste running at an 8 watt manual TDP, but it drops down to about 4. And here with a 1200p resolution and 60 frames per second, I got 13 hours and 7 minutes of battery life. So if you're trying to play really lightweight games, you can expect something that's around 12 hours, which is pretty impressive. Now for Hades, I also went with an 8 watt manual TDP, but then also dropped it down to an 800p resolution to keep it at a steady 60 frames per second. And here I got just under 7 hours of battery life, so again, very impressive. Now for Doom Eternal, I set it to the 12 watt endurance mode, and this worked out pretty well with 800p medium settings. This gave me an average frame rate of 70 frames per second, and I got 4 hours and 39 minutes of battery life. Moving on from there, we have the manual 17 watt TDP, which is my preferred one for most PC games. This I ran at 800p low with XeSS turned on, and I got an average frame rate of 50 frames per second. And for this setup, I got just under 3.5 hours of gameplay. Then finally on the far left, we have Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. So this one I tried to push it as far as I could. And here setting it to a manual 30 watt TDP at 1200p low settings with XeS turned on, I got an average frame rate of about 35 frames per second. This does pull over 40 watts from the battery, which means I got less than 2 hours, so 1 hour and 50 minutes. And bear in mind that I was trying to draw as much power as possible from Ratchet & Clank in this scenario. If I was just playing it myself, I would set it to a manual 17 watt TDP with these same settings, and I would probably get somewhere between like 32 and 35 frames per second anyway. And again, that's going to give me somewhere close to 3.5 hours of battery life compared to less than 2. Also of note, on the top right, you can see that the discharge when in sleep mode was about 3% overnight. And so that sleep mode is about on par with most Windows laptops and handhelds, so I'm not surprised by that. And finally, when it comes to charging this 80 watt-hour battery from 0 to 100, it took me about an hour and a half. And it definitely does charge pretty fast, somewhere between like 60 and 65 watts, which is really impressive. Okay, I think it's enough testing, so let's move on and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus. As always, we'll start with what I like, and I think the number one overall thing here is that it feels like a second generation handheld. The original MSI Claw had its own share of problems, but I feel like this one just feels like an upgrade in every single way. And I feel like we wouldn't have the MSI Claw that we have today if it wasn't for the failures of the previous one. And so I do appreciate the fact that MSI stuck around to make a second generation, and I hope they make a third as well. Some of the things I really liked about this device include that efficient gaming. I found that at 8 or even 17 watt TDPs, most of the games that I wanted to play just great. And again, this is almost the opposite of the original MSI Claw. I also like that we have a bigger 80 watt-hour battery. Much like with the ROG Ally X, it kind of takes away all of my battery anxiety. Instead of constantly having to check the battery to see whether or not I have enough time to play a game, I don't even think about it. I just plug it in when I'm done with my gaming session. I also like that they have a larger screen. In addition to being 8 inches, I like that it's 16 by 10. I prefer that. This means it's going to work really well with retro gaming, basically anything it's going to play in 4x3. And overall, I think it has decent controls. The D-pad's a little bit hard on my thumb with certain games, but overall, I actually like everything. And much like with the original Claw, I think this one has excellent audio, to the point where it enhances my gameplay experience. Now, of course, this device is not perfect, so let's go over some of the things I don't like about it. Number one is the fact that it is pretty heavy, and so if you found the original Steam Deck or ROG Ally to be too heavy for you, this is going to be a lot worse. Thankfully, the 8-inch screen does allow me to rest it on my lap and still be able to see what I'm doing, and so I can take a break here and there, and that has worked out really well. I also think that we're seeing some teething when it comes to the GPU drivers. Intel has definitely made a lot of improvements with the Lunar Lake chip compared to the previous CPU. But at the same time, it still does feel like they're playing catch-up, especially when it comes to drivers. There are some games that just don't run as well as they should compared to AMD platforms. I also was not a fan of the power management options that we have within the software. In addition to the MSI options, we've got a bunch of Intel options, and neither of them are perfect, so I would much rather see a single streamline option. But the real kicker here is the price. At $900, this is the most expensive mainstream handheld on the market. And I don't feel like the MSI Claw is hundreds of dollars better than the competition. If anything, I would say that they're about on par between the ROG Ally and the Legion Go and the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus in terms of just the overall experience of playing your games. But the surprising thing is just how big of a leap it was from the original MSI Claw to this one. And in the end, I do think the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus, despite having a kind of clunky name, is actually a very good handheld. It's got a big battery, it's got a big screen, the controls are decent on it, and it is really efficient at those lower TDPs. And I think if this device was cheaper, at least on par with the ROG Ally X, it would be a lot easier to recommend. But as it stands at the current $900 retail price, I can't really recommend it over other options that are cheaper than it, especially given the fact that this is a brand new CPU that needs some work on its Intel graphics drivers. So in the end, if you are watching this video right now as I first release it, then no, I can't really recommend the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus. At $900, I'm not really sure why you would pick the MSI Claw over the other options. If you want a big screen, then you can grab the Legion Go. If you want a big battery, you can grab the Ally X, and both of them are going to be cheaper. Not to mention the fact that the base price of the Steam Deck is over half the price of the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus. However, if you are watching this in the future and the price has dropped on it to something that's reasonable for your budget, and we've seen some Intel graphics drivers updates, then yeah, I think this actually might be a winner. But those are a lot of caveats, and we're also talking about potential future prospects. So as it stands, yes, this might be a contender in the future, but right now I would recommend getting something else. And again, this doesn't mean that the MSI Claw is a bad handheld. I think it is a good handheld. It really just comes down to your budget and whether or not you really love MSI more than the others. At the very least, because it's being sold in Best Buy, you could always pick it up, give it a spin, and then return it if it doesn't really match your needs. So in conclusion, the MSI Claw that I've been testing here, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is a loaner unit from MSI, so I'm going to mail it back to them this week. And even though I bought my first MSI Claw, I do not plan on buying this one here. I've got so many other devices that are like it, the Ally X, the Legion Go, and the Steam Deck. And even though this is a good handheld, it's not worth it for me to spend $900 to get a similar experience on things that I already own. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you in the market for a handheld PC? Do you already have one? And does the MSI Claw move the needle for you at all? For my part, I think this was a big jump from the original to the new one, and I think that if they make a third generation, I'm excited to see what kind of jump we'll see there as well. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.